Hello, friends. So what can no noisy party do without? Doesn't matter if it's a birthday, a prom, or just a Friday night. All of these fun events just wouldn't be the same without alcohol. Well, as you probably understand from the title, today we're going to talk about one of the most controversial laws. In the document about Tetraethyl lead, we already talked about the 18th Amendment and how it has affected the energy industry. Today, however, we take a closer look at the issue. Meet Murad IV, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire from 1623 to 1640. He was a rather brutal ruler himself. He's known primarily for his participation in the Ottoman-Safavid War, but that is of no particular interest to us now. What we are interested in is the Turkish coffee houses. During revolts, Murad wanted to deprive people of the opportunity to gather in one place, and so he banned coffee houses. And then, the consumption of coffee. He banned tobacco, and he also banned alcohol. Besides that, he disguised himself as a peasant and personally supervised the execution of this order, and those who did not comply with this prohibition, Murad executed. Eventually, the ban was lifted in 1640, immediately after the death of the Sultan. Now, let's fast forward to the 20th century and move to Iceland. At the beginning of the 20th century, the fight against alcoholism and alcoholic beverages began to gain strength all over the world, and Iceland was no exception. Smart fellows in the government scratched their heads and decided to hold a referendum in 1908. The referendum was a little tricky, and it was something like, do you want to ban alcohol in 1915? Well, the people thought, a whole 7 years? It's not that soon. We can support this progressive movement. And so they voted for prohibition. As a result, the prohibition lasted until 1989. Can you imagine? A full 74 years, but not quite. The Spaniards came to the rescue of the drinkers. Before the ban, Iceland and Spain were trading heavily. Iceland sold fish to Spain, and Spain sold wine to Iceland. At some point, the Spaniards lost their market. The smart fellows in the Spanish government scratched their heads and said, either you buy wine from us, or we will stop buying your fish. In turn, the smart guys in the Icelandic government didn't want to lose their market, so they scratched their heads and said, okay, and they amended the law to allow wine. And in the 30s, they looked at the United States. Apparently fearing an increase in crime, the authorities decided to lift the ban on strong alcohol. And since 1935, there was only a ban on beer. It is not known what these smart fellows did for the next 50 years, but at some point they scratched their heads again and finally lifted the ban on beer in 1989. The Soviet Union did two things from its beginning to its end. It was building communism and fighting drunkenness, and it's hard to say which of these goals had a better chance of being achieved. It began back in 1914. Back then, the Russian Empire had entered World War I, and Emperor Nicholas II issued a decree banning the sale of vodka throughout the country. A month later, the excise duty on beer was raised, as a result of which it skyrocketed in price. But the years went by. First came 1917 and the Civil War, and then 1918 came. Russia withdrew from the war, the Bolsheviks came to power, and Nicholas II was shot. But the prohibition on alcohol remained until 1925. A new attempt to instill sobriety in Soviet citizens began in 1929, but Soviet citizens did not stop drinking. Instead, they massively switched to moonshine. And so it was during all the anti-alcohol bans. As soon as the government turned on the ban, people turned on the moonshine machine. If you can't beat them, join them. Probably with this phrase, the party introduced a monopoly on vodka. Soberly observing that the country needed the budget revenues from alcohol sales more than it needed healthy citizens, it was decided to soften the ban. Thus, a 30-degree vodka appeared on the market, which was met with a great deal of skepticism. We will skip a few unsuccessful attempts to eradicate alcoholism and go back to 1985. Around that time, people began to realize that communism could not be built, but what if they could instill sobriety? And despite the revenues to the budget from the sale of liquor products, the party began to drastically reduce production. But despite the increased life expectancy and the mass consciousness, this law was perceived as an absurd initiative. Along with the reduction of alcohol production, the production of agriculture products also decreased, and part of the economy went gray. The economic crisis began, and after it, in 1991, the USSR dissolved. And with it, the attempts to defeat alcoholism did the same. In Canada, they tried to ban alcohol back in the 19th century, but despite pressure from activists, the government needed the alcohol industry. Alcohol was completely banned in 1918. However, whiskey could still be sold in pharmacies. It was enough to have a doctor's prescription to buy it, and this prescription only cost a couple of dollars. It is not difficult to guess that the number of sick people had increased sharply. In 1920, the ban was lifted. Perhaps the government simply realized that this law was not working, and not only was alcohol not profitable to the Treasury anymore, but also that controlling the trafficking of illegal substances required funds, and the government saw it as a potential super profit. After all, another country next door has decided to implement the ban. What kind of country is that? What do you think? As many have already figured out, Canada's neighbor who was about to start a sober lifestyle was the United States of America. In December 1917, they proposed the so-called 18th Amendment, and in fact the country switched to prohibition in 1920. The basic rules were as follows. The manufacture, sale, or transportation of liquor within the country is prohibited. This also applied to the import of alcohol from other countries. Well, let's see, smirked the Canadian liquor makers. Notice, my friends, it was forbidden to produce, sell, and import alcohol, but no one was forbidden to actually consume it. Great. There was actually a reason Congress went to the trouble of draining the country of liquor. The U.S. was seriously plagued by rampant drunkenness, so much so that everyone from cops to bureaucrats was drinking. In short, a drunken society has always had more problems than a sober one. Obviously, it was necessary to do something, and most importantly, someone had to do it. Every problem has its opponents. Alcoholism in the U.S. had its opponents in the form of activists who created the so-called anti-saloon movement. Their ranks included representatives from religion, teetotaling ladies who were fed up with drunken men, and just supporters of the healthy lifestyle for whom the morning did not begin with a mug of bourbon. All of this righteous company, first timidly and then more and more boldly, carried the idea of abstaining from alcohol into American society. They walked with posters, shouted different slogans against drinking in the streets, and in general they got as far as the 18th Amendment. An interesting fact is that one of the main teetotalers and opponents of alcohol was old fellow Henry Ford, but during Prohibition, right in his cars, bootleggers, smugglers successfully dispatched alcohol. What's even funnier is that Henry developed the engines for his cars, assuming that they would run on alcohol. You can watch a clip on our channel about what cars drove on at that time in the US and what diabolical fuel mankind came to then. We've put together a great and interesting film for you all about it. And what about the dry law? Oh yeah. They introduced it in the U.S. in 1920, and it was called the Volstead Act, and they broke it 1 hour after taking it. And in general, when something is prohibited, people are quick to find ways around it and invent various tricks. In this case, for example, pharmacists became rich because it was possible to buy a bottle of whiskey with prescription. Of course, the number of people who were sick and needed such prescriptions skyrocketed. Bootlegging, which is the smuggling of alcohol, began to flourish, and serious guys with big guns were involved in it. Illegal underground bars were opened. They were also called speakeasies because you had to go to the door and say quietly, "I'm from Joe," and the door to a closed and illegal bar realm would open. Of course, all this led to a powerful wave of corruption in many government agencies. The bootleggers bribed many representatives of the law, and in general, crime increased several times. To give you an idea of what I'm talking about, in the first 6 months alone, over 7,000 cases of violation of prohibition were opened. And how many more have been covered up by corrupt police officers? Nobody knows. It got to the point that the government gave the order to add poisons to the technical alcohols that were used in production, because they were also consumed internally. But even from the poisoned industrial alcohol, people learned how to evaporate poisons and successfully use this wonderful liquid as a drink. And Canada. From Canadian side to the U.S. borders, huge amounts of smuggled liquor made their way. People smuggled it into the U.S. in every way possible. The neighbors to the north simply got rich from this illegal market. And another thing, all the money from liquor trafficking wasn't entering the state treasury. It seemed that after the introduction of prohibition, there were even more questions. In general, soon there appeared opponents of the prohibition law who walked around with their poster saying, "We want beer," or something like that. Also, the Great Depression hit the U.S. in the 1930s, and getting liquor back into the legal lane would do a good job of boosting the economy. Taxes could flow back into the state's pockets. All based on this, Franklin Roosevelt, who was president at the time, signed the amendment to the law in the spring of 1933, which relaxed prohibition. And in the winter of that same year, 1933, the 21st Amendment was introduced to finally repeal prohibition. It took 13 years to assess and understand whether a strict abolition of alcohol could improve all aspects of American society. Certainly, there was a positive effect somewhere, but on the whole, the 21st Amendment did succeed. These were not all the countries trying to protect their citizens from alcohol. Norway, Finland, the Philippines, the full list of countries you are about to see on the screen, in fact. And in all of these countries, we see similar consequences. The economy suffers from the ban. An entire industry goes underground. The budget is not being replenished from taxes, and controlling prohibition requires new funds. Jobs are being cut. Demand for agricultural products decreases. Crime is flourishing, making super profits from the sale of illegal booze. Corruption levels rise, which plays into the hands of the criminals. No one controls the quality of illegal alcohol, which leads to increased mortality. Is there a silver lining to prohibition? Let us know what you think in the comments below.